In this video, I'm going to cover the basics about the method section. What goes into it in terms of what sections need to make up the method section, and then how to write it, what goes into it with regard to the detail that you need to include. Let's begin with the heading. So methods, the word methods is a level 1 heading, and what this means is that this word methods is centered on the page. It's also in bold font, capital letter for the first letter of the word methods, so there's capital M followed by lowercase letters. So that's a level 1. So that's the first thing you want to see in the methods section. Now, what is a method section? The biggest word here to know, and keep this in the back of your mind, is that the method section is all about replication. That's a key word in scientific research, is I, as a third party or an outside party to your study, should be able to pick up your method section, read it, and then replicate your study just by reading the method section alone. So the reason why this word is important is because you want to keep that in mind as you're writing the method section, that am I providing enough detail such that somebody reading this is going to be able to repeat the study and replicate it. For example, if you just say something like the students use computers, what does that mean? That's really vague, right? So I need to know what types of computers, how big the screens were, what kind of input devices did they use, what type of computer program did they use, how long were they on it, and things like that. So again, it's all about replication. Another way to look at it is essentially it's your how-to guide. So you're providing somebody else with a how-to with regard to what went down with your method section. What did the participants do exactly? What was involved for them? And so forth. Okay, so let's start with the first section in the methods section is participants. This is a level 2 heading. And that means this is left justified, so it's on the left margin of the page. It's also in bold font, and it has a capital letter for the first letter of the word, followed by a lowercase letter. That's a level 2 heading. So that's the first section in the methods. Now, another key point is why participants, why not subjects? The word subjects is an old term that isn't used anymore. We want to use participants because there's a designation now. Participants means you're using humans who participated in your study, and one of the reasons for that is because the humans voluntarily participated in your study. We don't use the word subjects to talk about humans because that is a little bit derogatory, and it also kind of lends the message that this might not be voluntary for them and actually might be somewhat coerced. So we don't want to use the word subjects. In the participants section, there's a couple of things to include. One is the demographic information. Any demographic variable that can potentially influence the results of your study should be included. So what's an example of that? What is the age of the participants? Lots of times researchers will list two things. Maybe they'll list the range of the ages, also the mean, what's the average age range, what's the average of the age of the participants. So the participants range in age between 18 and 20 with a mean age of 19 years. Okay, another thing to include is gender, of course, right? Talk about how many males and females were included, because maybe they will respond to the measures differently. That's one thing. One other thing to include. What about socioeconomic status? Now, in your school districts, many times you have information with regard to socioeconomic status. For example, free reduced lunch, right? That relates to socioeconomic status. There are lots of other things that go into SES as well, but that's a quick, easy way to gives some indication of the socioeconomic status of your participants. And of course, the number. How many participants were included in the study? So any demographic information that you can share with the reader so that they know, the age range, the gender, socioeconomic status, the number of participants, and so forth, so that they have a pretty good idea of who's included. Again, remember, the key word is replication. So if you included 20 participants and 10 of them were male and 10 of them were female, I can do the same thing too when I replicate your study. All right? Another thing to talk about is how the participants were selected. Was it random selection? And I realize this might not be the case for some of you, because for example, some of you were just special education teachers who might only have 6 or 8 students in your caseload, and that's okay, but you still need to talk about how the participant was selected for the study. Others have access to lots more students. Maybe they have access to 4 fourth grade classrooms, and then they can randomly select those students from those classrooms. That's great. If that's your case, talk about how that was randomly selected or not. Were the participants given an incentive to participate? Oftentimes with college research, we can give them course credit. We can offer the students who participate, maybe a raffle towards some prize. I've personally raffled off an iPod before for my research. And the raffle's a really good idea because it really gives a good incentive for them to participate. But anyway, maybe you can do this for your participants as well. But what was the incentive, if any? Maybe some of you don't have incentives for participation, and that's fine too, but mention that. That's an important thing to mention too, that no incentive was given. These students were, they volunteered on their own accord without any incentive because, one could argue that because you offered an incentive, that limits, the pool of people who would go to your study. Maybe only people motivated for the incentive would participate. So again, it kind of lends to some credibility issues with validity and so forth. But anyway, was your study incentivized or not? Okay, another thing to talk about is how were they assigned, if they were, to groups? Now I realize some of you have A-B research designs, and if that's the case, then they're not, then they're not assigned to groups, right? But they are, doing something else, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if you're doing an experiment, how many groups were there? Was there a control group? Well, there has to be for an experiment, but maybe there was 1 or maybe even 2 control groups. How were they assigned to those groups? How many experimental groups were there? Maybe there were 3 experimental groups. I've done situations where I've had 5 experimental groups and 1 control group. And these all need to be explained as to how a participant landed in one of these groups. The second part of the methods section is the apparatus and materials. Now again, you wouldn't number this in the methods section. I'm just numbering it here so that you can keep track of what point that we're on. But the participant section is followed by the apparatus and materials. In most of the studies that you're reading, and you're finding and reading, you probably see this just labeled materials, and that's fine. There's no problem with that whatsoever, and actually that's very common. I wanted to go a step further and label this apparatus and materials so that you can learn the difference between the two. Okay, so what is the difference? Let's learn that now. Apparatus refers to the equipment to collect data. To collect the data. What do I mean by that? Well, did you have computers, and if so, what were they? Did you have iPads, and so forth? So remember I said earlier that this needs to be detailed enough so that I know you know exactly what kind of computers you used and exactly what kind of iPads that you use so that I can replicate it. So it's not enough just to say, oh, the students sat in front of computers and they did something, blah, blah, blah. That isn't enough. I need to know, was it a Mac? You know, was it a PC? How big was the monitor? You know, and so forth. When I did my dissertation, I went down to describe the PC with regard to the processor. You know, I described the brand it was, you know, and so forth. Again, replication, so that if you wanted to repeat my dissertation, you can pick up the exact same computer with the same 19-inch monitor hooked up to it, and then you can repeat that study that I did. What type of iPad was it? Was it an iPad mini? Was it iPad Air? Whatever it was. That's the apparatus. That's the equipment, right? What is the materials? The materials refers to the measurement of the variable. So what was used to actually measure the dependent variable? Now, in this case, likely you're going to use some surveys, you're going to use some tests, maybe some of you are using standardized tests and so forth. You're going to be using certain computer programs. Note the difference, right? So the computer itself is an apparatus, but the program is the material. So the program is the actual thing, you know, that is measuring the students, maybe their verbal ability or so forth. That's the measurement, that's the material. But the computer itself is the apparatus. So now you know the difference. So again, you need to describe these in really, really good detail so that I can repeat your study. Another key point is when you're mentioning the measures, again, these are the things you're using to measure the dependent variable, remember, right? It isn't enough just to say, oh, we're using the self-esteem inventory. It isn't enough detail. What I need there is I need to know, you know, how many questions were there subscales. Lots of times surveys have subscales. What was the score? Was it a numerical score? What was the range of possible scores? How do you go ahead and actually score the instrument altogether? How is it scored? And then, how is the number interpreted? So again, you're giving the reader lots of information about, well, here's a measure we're using. It has this number of items. Here is an example of an item, another important point to include. Here's a sample item. Here's the range of scores that are possible from this measure, and here's how the numbers are interpreted. If there's a rating scale that ranks from 0 to 5, that the participant needs to rank something, give an indication of what the numbers in between mean. For example, this could mean not at all, this could mean very much, and so forth. All right? Another key point to mention about the measures that a lot of people are missing is the reader, in a really good study, is going to include information about the reliability and the validity of each and individual measure. I'll just word test or measure here. So a good study will list these two things in their method section when they talk about the measures. You want to include these. Well, why do you want to include those? Well, the reason is because, again, you're trying to give the reader an indication that you're engaged in solid research. Your study is sound. Your methodology to your study is sound, and that's shown or even further validated by the fact that you're using tests that have been proven with reliability and with regard to validity. So this test that you're using holds water, if you will, and you're kind of validated in using these measures, which further gives the reader indication that numbers that result from your study are probably pretty good. If you don't include this information about your measures, it just kind of leaves a big question mark with regard to the results of your study. The reader might not be as confident with the results that are rendered from your study. So you want to include those. Okay, the last part that I want you to write in your method section is the procedure. One thing that I have noticed is that this section so far, from what I've read, seems to be a little under-detailed. Now, you want to make sure that this is the definitive how-to guide for the reader. You give the reader a how-to guide, exact, precise, as much as you can with regard to detail, guide to what the procedure was, what the participants did. So that's the thing that you should keep in the back of your mind. What did the participants do throughout the entire study? It isn't enough just to say, oh, they sat in front of the computer for 20 minutes and then we measured them on a scale. That definitely is not enough. Everything needs to be presented in chronological order. One thing that I noticed is that there's sometimes a lack of the chronological order to things. So when I'm reading, it seems that sometimes some steps are kind of out of place. So you want to make sure that the steps that you write about, that the participant went through, are in that chronological order, so that it flows really well, and the reader can understand exactly step to step what occurred. The participants sat down, they came in a room, they did this for 20 minutes, twice a week, they were given the measure at this point, and so forth. If you did an experiment, what type of manipulations were involved. If you did an A-B design, you want to talk about, what were the different phases of the study. Some of you are doing an A-B design with two phases. Some are doing it with 4. Whatever you did, what exactly occurred during these 2 or 4 phases? So there really shouldn't be any question at all with regard to what the participants did during that phase. How long did it last? When did they know, when did you know that it went from one phase to another? How was that transition marked? Were there assessments given? I'm guessing that there was, between the 2 phases and so forth. So again, you want to make sure that this is your definitive how-to guide, and there really isn't. You want to err on the side of providing too much detail as opposed to not enough detail. It's always easier to cut detail back rather than adding to it in the future. So provide lots and lots of detail.